And we should be recording. So, welcome everyone. My name's Damien. I'm one of the assistant principals at Suzanne Cory High School, and this is our session titled Creating a Positive Learning Environment at Home for Highly Able Secondary Students, with a focus on, as you can see, building trust, respectful relationships, and supporting aspirations, wellbeing, and achievement. Um, just to do an acknowledgement of country, we acknowledge the Bunurong and Wadawurrung peoples as the traditional owners of the lands on which we operate this meeting, and we pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So, just want to reiterate the welcome, and the focus for this evening's session for you is about our positive learning environment, which is the outer rim of what we call our pedagogical model. And it focuses on a safe and respectful, encouraging setting that we intentionally create in our classrooms at our school that encourages students to feel valued and supported and motivated to engage deeply in their learning. And it's characterised by a number of different elements, none of which we're going to focus on all of them tonight, but focus on a particular aspect of that. So, why are we running this session and similar sessions like it through the course of this year into next year? Our data shows us that there is a need and a desire from parents and carers for you to want to have some information that we can provide for you to help support your child's learning, to build confidence, to support your child's learning at home, and most importantly, provide you with opportunities to participate in your child's education. So there are a couple of reasons, and we've got some sort of trend of our data from our parent caregiver and guardian community engagement survey that parents fill in annually. That gives us a bit of I suppose, a platform for us to design some sessions, which hopefully you will find useful and helpful and can implement and apply some of the strategies at home. So just the last thing before I introduce Alex is just to note that we firstly thank you for your time and your interest in attending this evening. And we acknowledge that parenting is a highly complex adventure. I have two teenagers myself, so I can completely empathise. And there's no playbook, but the focus for this session is really to reinforce that the session is practical and it focuses on a strengths-based approach. And hopefully there are some tools that you might be able to apply, and some sentence starters and questions that you might be able to apply with your own children at home. So I'm going to pass over to Alex, who is one of our learning specialists at Suzanne Cory High School with a particular expertise in the positive learning environment.
Hi, good evening. I'll just reiterate what Damien said. Thank you very much for taking the time, especially 6:30 on a weekday. I know that's a very busy time for most families. So as Damien said, we're going to dive straight into looking at how you as parents have an opportunity at home to really build an environment that extends from our school and that positive learning environment at school, and create one at home. So to begin though, we want to just acknowledge that we are working with students who are highly able. They attend our school because they've managed to get through the exam process. They succeed at our school, and we understand that there are certain characteristics about those students that are really wonderful and they're real strengths. We also recognise, though, that highly able students have particular unique types of challenges. And so tonight, if we go to the next screen, we're going to have a look at some of those. Oh, yes, some of those in a moment. But I'd like you to think first about what you identify. Try to identify one or two of the challenges that you have with your child or children, in terms of their academics or in terms of their relationships with you at home. And I would like you to consider those throughout the evening, throughout the presentation, in the context of the information I present. So for Damien, we just again, some of the typical responses quite often from our families include low motivation, so high aspirations but low motivation, high levels of stress, high levels of perfectionism. Sometimes communication can be quite light on at home. Children are not communicating very clearly with their parents, and when they do, it's quite often highly emotional under stressful situations. Students managing expectations, but also parents managing expectations tends to be a bit of a challenge. And then this balance of well-being and academics, and then lastly, friendships or belonging. So these might sort of pop up in your mind as something that's happening at home with you and your child or children. And so either select something relevant to you from the list or something you've already identified. And as I said, I'd like you to try and consider that throughout our session. Damien? So some of the goals for this session, as Damien said, is to be referring to elements of our pedagogic model in the positive learning environment. In order to try and for parents to understand some of the specific needs of highly able adolescents. So we're focusing on supporting these high expectations that our students, children, and our families have, but balancing that with the right amount of pressure rather than unhealthy pressure. We're going to focus on building trust, bi-directional trust between children and their parents and families in order to build really respectful, strong, high-quality relationships. And again, focusing on looking for opportunities for empathy over pressure when students are coming home and potentially not performing the way that they're capable of. And ideally, at the end of this session, you'll have a toolkit of different practical strategies that you can draw on, mostly to do with the language that you could use, as Damien said, some sentence starters, some ideas around how to substitute certain terminology that is much more strength-based rather than exclusively sort of disciplinary. Damien, will you click, please? So language throughout is key. That's one of our goals of this evening. I'll just click again. So first off, I just wanted to sort of suggest to you to consider that high ability doesn't always mean an easy pathway. And so first, I'd like to challenge you with a bit of information about learning. So regardless of how highly able somebody is in terms of their learning, the longer it takes them to learn something, the better they retain that information. So arguably someone who actually doesn't understand something as quickly as maybe a more highly able student, they in theory could actually learn it much better and retain it better for assessments later, for instance. So that's one example. Other examples that we see in students' behaviours are high sensitivity and perfectionism. We see intense emotions and potentially sometimes not very highly regulated emotions. A very strong moral compass, so their justice systems are very, very strong. Highly curious, but we also see some uneven development. So quite often these students develop academically very fast. They learn fast, they understand concepts quickly, they connect ideas very quickly, but emotionally they may be at a standard level with their age range. We also see very high internal expectations, which of course leads to internalized pressure, which does not necessarily then equate to high performance. So what I'd like you to do, I've got these little parent discussion prompts throughout the presentation where I'd like you, just as I said, sort of prompt you to think of whether any of these characteristics or behavioural patterns are familiar for you and your family and your children. So as you're thinking about that, what we like to do is just make it very clear that sometimes what we see on the surface, it does not necessarily reflect what's actually happening underneath. So at school, quite often when we put chronicles up for student academic behaviour, it could be for avoidance of completing work. And if we just look at it as it is, we might just think that someone is perhaps being lazy or disorganized, but often you have a conversation with that student and what actually that reflects is a fear of not doing well, not being perfect, fear of failure, fear of not meeting the expectations that they have of themselves or their families perhaps have of them. When we see perfectionism, quite often that actually reflects anxiety or pressure. Perfectionism is quite maladaptive in terms of an attitude or a behavior, and it's not sustainable, particularly in really high stress situations. So whenever I just would always like to point out that stress is quite adaptive. It's good for students for learning, but anxiety means that they're no longer coping. So being able to differentiate the difference, parents have a really important role to recognize when someone is stressed and coping and when someone is experiencing anxiety. Argumentative behaviour is really interesting. This is not exclusively highly able students in select entry schools by any margin. It's quite typical of adolescents. And really what arguments or argumentative behaviour involves is that adolescents are going through a phase in life, we all understand, we've all been there, that they are looking for more autonomy and agency and independence in their lives. And it just happens to coincide often with middle school or VCE or IB, where the stakes are high. But I just wanted to point out, in case parents didn't know, that during adolescence, from early puberty all the way through to early 20s and sometimes 30s, adolescents' prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of their brains, they actually regress in terms of the connections they have between neurons. And that ability to self-regulate actually decreases through adolescence. So those critical years during high school, especially those last couple of years, sort of 17, 18, 19 years of age, they're in the peak period of less communication between the neurons in that part of the brain. And so whilst they are expressing a desire for more autonomy, they are not regulating themselves so well. And so as the mature adult in the family unit, an awareness of that means it's easier to respond appropriately when perhaps they seem unreasonable or disorganized. And just quickly to finish this slide, disengagement from learning or activities that they're normally used to can be either a sign of burnout and anxiety or actually a lack of challenge, so they may not be extended enough. And finally, that emotional intensity, as I said, deep investment or sensitivity around work or performance or outcomes or friendships, that's quite typical of the age. So we'll move to the next slide. And so, as Damien said before, we at school, we use our school pedagogic model to inform the vast majority of our practice to do with teaching, student-teacher relationships. And for our session tonight, we're really focusing on the outside green area. And if you click one more time, Damien, we will be focusing on these top 3 elements of that outside area, which is how to build that high trust and independence in relationships at home, how to create autonomy supportive environments for that, some ways to try and increase the respectful and empathetic language used between children and their parents and caregivers, and then also just within the context of high expectations and high aspirations, how do we maintain that motivation whilst looking after all those other elements of their social well-being and academic sort of attitudes and behaviours. So click again, and we're going to move into the first of these 3 elements. So they're just itemised at the top numerically. So number 1, we're going to look at trust first. So trust, we all understand the term trust, but in the context of adolescence and learning, what we know is that trust supports well-being, so social development, interpersonal development, and also achievement, including academics. So when a child feels that they can trust people in their lives, they feel safe. Safety first and foremost. Nothing else will be optimal if they can't feel safe. If they feel heard and understood, they will feel safer. If they're trusted with increasing independence, when we consider their age and we know that they're going through a period of normal biological separation, that they're trying to be more and more independent, if you allow that and you demonstrate open trust, then they're going to be more likely to trust you back. And if they are clearly valued beyond achievement. So if you click beyond there, Damien. What we see is that when children feel trusted and that bidirectional, they trust in the opposite direction, their motivation increases, and that specifically is intrinsic motivation. They're more likely to seek help when they recognize there's a deficit in their behaviors or attitudes and they need someone to assist. They're much more likely to regulate their emotions better because they trust that the person, the soundboard who they come home to and unload to, if they've had a rough day, that they trust that they're going to listen and not judge. They're more resilient, and they're academically far more self-determined and persistent in spite of adversity and challenge.
Alex, sorry to interrupt.
Yes.
Could Damien mute because we're getting an echo?
Oh, yes. Thank you.
I think you're in the same room. Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for saying that. Is that Sarah?
Yep, that was me. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you, Sarah. All right, so if you move to, so this slide here. So just a practical example is this idea again that language is key. So if we want to move to an autonomy supportive environment at home, which as I said is an extension of our school environment for learning, what we're hoping for and what we envision is that rather than monitoring student learning and application in homework, for instance, is to be a mentor. So this is built on trust. And it won't be perfect, obviously. Sometimes kids come home and they don't do their homework, and that is an opportunity to build this idea of mentoring. So instead of saying, for instance, have you done your homework? Have you finished your homework? An example that is a strength-based, trust-oriented phrase would be, what does your homework lineup look like this afternoon? So this is raising the idea that the homework is there and it needs to be done, but it's once again, it's autonomy supportive. It's allowing that your child to be the one who is the expert. They know what their homework is. They know what their workload is. They know what they're capable of doing tonight, and invite them to tell you what that is. Instead of saying, are you working hard enough, which is a judgment on their efforts, recognize that if they're doing a good job, it's probably challenging them. So what is challenging you? Tell me about it. I don't know. I don't understand this content. I don't know this skill. And inviting them to be the expert in that situation and share it with you. And that interaction, that bidirectional interaction, really builds trust and that autonomy supportive environment. And over time, that builds habits and routines that's really helpful and supportive for trust at home. Damien? So the focus for the parent or the adult at home would be on curiosity around what their child is doing at school, what they've brought home, what they're learning, what's challenging, and then offering to be collaborative. So I'm here to support, but I recognize you're the one who has the burden of the learning and the work to do. And so they're the ones who decide, I guess. You're inviting them to decide what to do, to be the leader of that collaborative relationship. So you can problem solve together, and what you're doing is respecting their autonomy quite overtly and openly. So another thing, just in terms of language is key, is that I very often will use the word challenge instead of something that's hard or difficult, because as soon as we label something as hard or difficult, it removes some of the agency that learner has around that problem and how they're going to be able to solve it. Whereas challenge invites the application of strengths and skills to look at things from a different point of view. So it's an example of when you're using language with your child, just substituting words like challenge is a really useful, proactive way to intentionally start building a positive language base and learning environment. Okay. All right, number 2 from our pedagogic model is building respectful relationships with an emphasis on empathy. So basically, if you want to be a strong positive influencer on your child's learning, really the best way, the empirical evidence over and over again shows that the best way to do that is to listen really deeply to what they are saying and it might not be what their words are, but it could be their body language, it could be their emotions. To explain using reasoning to show mutual respect. I sometimes when I'm working with staff at school, and maybe there's a student who perhaps hasn't done their work quite repetitively or regularly, or is not engaging in class as they used to, or something like that. There's an issue that's come up. I will remind staff that students sometimes go 1 hour from one subject to another hour on another subject, and then 2 hours on another subject, and then they have an assessment in a fourth subject, and then they have a fifth subject at the end of the day. That we have to respect the fact that they have done a huge amount of learning all day, and they have shifted from idea to idea to idea to skills, and showing mutual respect for the day that they've had, and then they come home. And I think the children, the students really respond very well to the acknowledgement that they have actually worked really hard, and that whilst we expect them to continue working hard within reason at home, that they're not starting from zero. They're starting with already fatigued brains and bodies. So again, language is really key. You can welcome their ideas, you welcome their questions, you allow them to be independent and make some decisions around how they work at home. And Damien, please. So some of the helpful phrases. So help me to understand, how was your day? Help me understand why you're tired today. Tell me more about that. They're the holders of the information. They're the holders of how they feel. Recognizing, so I see that this matters to you. Sometimes paraphrasing what they say reinforces to them that you've been listening. And then open-ended questions like, what do you think would help? Or how can I assist with this? Again, puts it's a reflection of trust, it's a reflection of mutual respect, and it allows them to be independent and to navigate or problem solve from the point of their own point of view and what would work best for them. Okay, so second part of respectful relationships is building empathy. And so empathy does not necessarily mean that you're agreeing with their behavior or agreeing with every response that they have. But what you are doing is validating an experience that they're having. So empathy and expectations can coexist. It means that you're demonstrating through your language or your behavior, your body language, that you understand that they have certain feelings, you're acknowledging their experience, and what you're doing is during periods of stress, which is usually kind of the situation we're talking about here, is that you're staying connected in spite of that. When adolescents are stressed, their brains get cognitively overloaded. And Damien, if you click, please. Oh, I've gone ahead, but one step back first. So empathy doesn't mean removing accountability, as I've sort of already implied. We don't lower expectations. We don't avoid difficult conversations. What we do though is acknowledge the state that they're in. So I can see that you're upset. Let's take a moment now to address how you feel before we then tackle our next part, which could be the homework or could be the project or could be something that they're doing. And if you click again, Damien, a really important point that we all would benefit from reminding ourselves from all the time, and I'm a parent too, and this is one of the things I have to remind myself of, is that stress is both a psychological but also physiological experience. So if someone is stressed, and if that stress has gone beyond stress to that maladaptive anxiety level, the brain is overloaded, and it is almost impossible to effectively learn in that state. So if you're able to recognize that physiological stress is quite acute, empathy is one way of trying to de-escalate that, the physical stress, before you then try and tackle whatever the problem is. And as I said, adolescents are actually emotionally less mature in that sort of age 14 to 18, 19-year range than they were when they were in primary school, late primary school, in terms of the neural connections in their brains. So we can't expect them to snap out of an emotional state, especially a negative emotional state, and if it's highly acute. So what we can do as the mature adult is try and intervene, reduce or de-escalate that physiological response so that then you can be productive. The two of you can work together collaboratively, mutually, respectfully, and try and address what the issue was. Okay, next slide. Moving into our third and final element of our pedagogic model today, which is supporting those high expectations or moderating those high expectations in a reasonable way in order to support and sustain high aspirations. So healthy expectation sounds like, from a parent or a teacher, you should be really pleased with your efforts. And the word efforts is really important again. Like the word challenge, that is an operationalized word. It's something that a student or a child knows what it means and what to do. It's something that they can action. Whereas you should be pleased with your performance is an end point, and they can't change a performance after the fact. They can change their efforts. So that kind of language is really useful. Once again, an open-ended statement like, what did you find the most challenging and interesting? And that's acknowledging challenge is part of learning, and that's not a bad thing. And what part of that was interesting to you? So what's motivating to you? What it matters to you? Adolescents have huge, big feelings and opinions, and it's important to acknowledge that. And then something really proactive is, how do you plan to address these next steps? So once again, that's putting the emphasis on what they're going to do, make them reflect on what's happened, what they're going to do next, what skills do they have, how can they apply them, what do they need to develop. Next click, please. So that's as opposed to pressure, which looks like somebody hearing, think about your future, which might be very short-term or long-term. Either way, could be totally out of their control. Saying that you're capable of more may very well be true, but there's a reason why they've not performed on this particular occasion, and it's much more useful and beneficial to tackle that reason rather than just saying, I guess, that you could have done more. Don't waste your potential. Highly able students know that they are there for a reason. They know that they have great potential, but that can be a huge pressure to them to try and meet that. And then when I was your age is just a very, I guess the pressure on the student is, it's kind of irrelevant, I guess. When I was your age, different situations, different times, those sorts of things can be very damaging, those sorts of statements. I think that kind of language can be much more damaging. The whole pressure language is much more damaging than parents sometimes realize. If we click again. And so I'd like you just to take a moment to reflect on, what do you think it looks like to a child or an adolescent when encouragement and pressure begin to feel different? So what sort of language is encouraging and proactive, and what kind of language is pressure and identifying deficits? Click again. So how do parents respond to when students have high aspirations and help them to define what that success looks like? Excuse me. So achievement, having high aspirations, is far more sustainable. So something that can be maintained, those behaviors and attitudes over time, when they're driven by purpose or intrinsic motivation. So what that actually looks like, quite a long way behind on my own slides here, is that when we're encouraging, what we're encouraging is having a purpose that is intrinsically motivated by the adolescent themselves. Being able to balance those high expectations and aspirations with their current skill set, the time frame they're working in, what they enjoy, their friends, their goals, the things that they find difficult, their family, their other commitments. Encourage persistence, even though adversity will often be the most obvious thing to them, and encourage them to be flexible, and that goals can move and timeframes are not set. And so some of the language you can use: what matters to you today, what challenged you today. Use that word meaningful. What kind of future feels meaningful to you, and what does success mean to you? And using a word like excited will quite often open a whole conversation around things that they really love to do, or things that they might be interested in doing. that they perhaps hadn't considered or they didn't feel as though were part of the agenda for their academics. But if you ask and then you use a word like excited, they're much more likely to trust that is a genuine question and of value for you to know. All right, so to finalize, some really practical things that you can do at home outside of the learning is firstly, create this emotional climate at home where there's respectful communication, that's calm, that if someone is stressed or emotional, that you respond to that before you try to problem solve, and ultimately you're creating psychological safety. The learning culture should really be one of curiosity and conversation and dialogue. Engage in their learning, recognize that they're probably the experts in what they're learning and how they're learning it, and allowing them to see that and build that sense of ownership and agency is really goes a long way for building trust and respectful relationships. And their ideas and their interests really matter. Certainly they matter to them, the here and now. Maybe in 6 months they don't, but it's important to them now, and so it's worth engaging. Healthy habits really is one of the most important things that parents can really help with. Sleep is one of the first ones that I will always encourage parents when I speak to them. You may not know, but adolescents need between 9 and 10 hours of sleep every night for optimal learning and general functioning. And I haven't done a survey formally, but I survey my students in my class quite often, and we're lucky to have 6 hours, I think, on average for most students. So sleep is really super important for developmental changes in terms of just going through adolescence, but also for learning. You need to have multiple sleep cycles in a night in order to get enough REM sleep, which is when consolidation of learning occurs. You probably are aware that most adolescents go through essentially a sleep disturbance called the adolescent sleep-wake cycle shift, where they tend not to fall asleep when they're tired, and there's a delay of up to 2 hours in the evening when they do fall asleep, but they still have to wake up in the morning to get to school or wherever they go, which means they're generally sleep deprived every night until the weekend when they sleep in, and then they try and catch up. So it's really important as parents to try and create that climate and that culture at home where a routine is really established. Everyone agrees to it, about downtime and balance and getting to sleep. So it involves limiting or even eliminating screens at least an hour before bed, not having work in bed, no screens in bedrooms if it can be helped, so that the bedroom is seen as a place for rest, and just things like food as well. So don't eat really too late. Ensure that it's quiet, ensure that light is low, and all those things help with healthy habits around sleep. And then finally, just allowing autonomy. So shared planning of time and what's important, and family commitments, and ownership for students should be encouraged around their learning and their time as well. Next slide, please. And so one simple weekly check-in is one way to start building this environment. So once again, it's around dialogue. So what's going well? What feels stressful? What supports would help you this week? What are you proud of this week? What challenges coming up this week? So the goal is to connect with your child before problem solving. Lastly, so that's the end of the presentation today. But what we are doing, Damien and I are doing, is building a range of resources, or a series of resources that help. They're very informative and accessible for parents that we'll be sending home. And they each unpack different elements of the positive learning environment. And so what the goal is that as parents, your knowledge and understanding of these factors, just through reading and listening to podcasts that we provide, will help just build some familiarity around adolescent learning, that socio-emotional development and academic outcomes. So the first one to be released, which is linked, we'll send out, is the Trust, Independence and Hope one. And finally, I'll hand over to Damien for the end. But finally, really just as a walk away, is that relationships and connection has to happen before performance. High expectations are great, but they work best with empathy, trust, and autonomy. And well-being has to be at the core of everything. That students won't achieve their best unless they are feeling well and psychologically safe. So thank you very much for your time this evening. I'll hand over to Damien. I really appreciate that everyone either came tonight or will listen to this recording later. And if you have any questions, you can find me on Compass.
Thank you so much, Alex. And just to finish with everyone, like Alex said, we're working on a series of resources that are practical and strength-based focused for parents, which I suppose we're testing as well. So we're pretty interested to get your feedback, not only on how useful and supportive you thought tonight's session was, but also on the actual resources themselves. Once you've had a chance to perhaps take a couple of those routines or a couple of those question starters or some of the reframing of language, and then they find their way into your own conversations with your child, we'll really be curious about your feedback on those. So there's a link in the slides today as well to that feedback survey. It'll just take a couple of minutes and you can add anything else as other than responses to the questions that we have. So thank you so much for joining us. A copy of the slides and a recording of tonight's session is also available through Compass, through school documentation, and there's a section there called the A to Z of school information and information session. So if you kind of follow that pathway, you'll find this session as well as future sessions and other sessions that other staff have run relating to different aspects of the school's programs and culture. So thanks again, everybody, and it was great to have you on board tonight. And look out for further sessions that Alex and I will be running through the course of the year as well. So I'm going to stop recording now and end the session. So thanks again.
If anyone has any questions, I will wait for a few minutes. If not, that's okay. You can go.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks, Damien.
Now I just need to work out where the recording's been saved.
It might. I think it goes. Oh, I can't remember.
That's all right. I'll work it out.
It says if you recorded it to the cloud, you have to
Yeah.
go onto your WebEx site
Okay.
or onto your hard drive, documents, WebEx recordings.
Right. Okay. Let's have a look. Documents.
Did you use the browser or the app?
No, I use the browser.
Yeah, so it could be on a cloud or on your hard drive then.
Okay. All right. I'll look around for it. It'll be there somewhere. All right. Thanks, Alex. That was awesome.
No worries. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow. Bye.